Welcome to the Decipher podcast. I'm Dennis Fisher, and my guest today is Brian Raftery, who just launched a brand new podcast called The Hollywood Hack, which is about the Sony hack, one of the biggest heists in Hollywood history. Brian, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Oh, thanks for having me. Happy to.
Yeah, I'm excited. I reached out to you right after I saw the promo for this podcast, and I had enjoyed your other podcasts, one on Siskel and Ebert and one on the Vietnam War movies from last summer.
Oh,
Really loved
thanks.
that
Yeah.
one.
Thank you.
And as soon as I saw the promo, I thought, oh my God, somebody's going to dig into the Sony hack, which, 10 years ago, everybody, like our audience, completely familiar with that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that anybody had really looked at it from the movie side of things. There was all the stories that came out at the time, which you dove into in the podcast itself. But a lot of that focused on sort of the very internal machinations at Sony about like salary structures and I was mean to this producer and this
Right.
producer was mean to me, that kind of stuff. I was really fascinated by kind of the way that Sony reacted to the intrusion itself
Hmm.
internally. What was it about this story that really attracted you and wanted you to do the podcast?
There were a couple of things. I mean, one was just sort of the fact that in the last couple of years there's been nothing comparable to the Sony hack in terms of the volume of material getting out there. But in the
Yeah.
last 5 or 6 years, every year and a half, there's some studio executive or TV executive whose texts get leaked somehow, either through reporters or through some sort of some sort of legal case, and there's also Slack DMs, and there's almost like more ways now to kind of get in trouble for what you write. And it was kind of shocking me that every time I would see some, big studio CEO having his text wind up in the press, I'm just like, didn't anyone learn anything from that? And then I sort of thought, well, wait a minute, I didn't learn anything from that because I still put all kinds of, I mean, nothing like offensive, but definitely dumb stuff that I wouldn't want out there. So it was one of those things where I was just kind of, it's always been in the back of my mind, like that was a very strange story. It happened so quick. And your audience, I'm sure, is very familiar with the Sony hack. And one thing that's kind of striking to me is I would talk to friends who don't work in media, keep up with the news, but they didn't always remember the whole story correctly. They were like, "Oh yeah, that's when that movie never came out, right?" And it's like, well, actually, it came out, but under a different. Or they don't remember who, like, or did they prove it was North Korea, or what happened? And I sort of felt like it had kind of become a lost story. I think a lot of stuff from the early 2010s, if we were to look back and go, oh, remember those 5 or 6 years before the wild election that kind of changed the course of our history happened? I think there's a couple of big events that happened that we've all kind of forgotten about. And I think it's very rare. It was exciting to me because 10 years is a good time to look back, but also it's one of those very rare stories that intersects with a whole bunch of things I'm interested in, which is the media, technology, Hollywood, just sort of world politics. It's very rare that you get a story that kind of goes into all those worlds. And it happened so quickly. Like the timeline on this is wild. It's like basically November to Christmas 2014, and then everyone just kind of forgot about it. That the idea of kind of trying to figure out what happened in that very compressed time was kind of exciting for me.
It's funny because right after we agreed to do the podcast, I went and looked back at the stories that I had written about the Sony hack in 2014. And I remember covering it, but I didn't remember how quick that timeline was. And when I looked at the story that we wrote about when the FBI came out and said, hey, it's North Korea, which everybody kind of knew, at least in the security community, was like, yeah, we certainly know it's North Korea. We know it's the Lazarus Group. It was only 3 weeks or maybe even less after the hack itself. So it was really fast. And then after that, obviously all the trickle of emails and all the embarrassing stuff sort of like kept going, for quite a while. But in the security world, it was pretty much wrapped up in 2.5, 3 weeks. It was
Yeah,
a really quick story.
yeah, it's a really and I imagine the security world, it was one of many notable hacks in the 2010s.
Yeah.
In the entertainment industry, there'd been nothing like this before, and it did kind of have this trickle down effect because even though I do think people are still, so I'm not speaking for every single person in Hollywood, but like some people are still kind of not super cautious about what they put in writing.
Hmm.
The effect it had on what kind of movies get made. I think, as we were working on the show, we were sort of trying to look at what is the long-term impact of this that you can really you can't really quantify it, but you can look at this controversial movie comes out. It's very provocative. It's made by a couple of filmmakers who are at the very height of their career in terms of making comedies. They can do whatever they want. The studio's like, great, go ahead, make this movie. You're going to kill a real world leader in this film, but we're behind you. We're going to give you a big budget. Um, And I think it was kind of last of its kind because I think for a lot of reasons, R-rated movies and comedies started falling out of favor. But I think The Interview, if you're a studio executive and you're like someone brings along a very controversial or potentially, you know, a movie that might really irk some people, I can't imagine in the back of your head you're not like, ooh, remember what happened to The Interview? Let's try to skip. Let's try to like not make that happen again. Not let that happen again.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I remember in the podcast you're talking about how Seth Rogen and his producing partner Evan Goldberg are sort of at the height of their powers, right? They were in that blank check sort of situation where they could kind of do whatever they want. And for whatever reason, they decided to make this movie, The Interview, which honestly I've never seen all the way front to back. I just can't, whatever. I think it's just too goofy for me. Like after like writing about it, and then even when you hear like you describe some of the scenes in the podcast, which is just hearing like this scene is in the movie or whatever, you're just like they didn't put that in a movie. Oh no, they did, and it's. I wonder how much of an effect you spoke to a lot of people at Sony and others in the industry. Did that have sort of a chilling effect on like let's not make you know let's walk it back a little bit from the edge on these stories?
I mean, I think there was, it's one of those things, like I said, it's impossible to go into every single meeting that's gone on in the last 10 years, the pitch meeting, and listen as the executives debate whether or not The Interview kind of, changed what kind of movies they wanted to make. But
Yeah.
I certainly feel like I do think there is kind of this, if you look at what's been made by the big studios in the last 10 years, even sort of like provocative dramas are sort of falling out of favor. And again, I realize there's millions of reasons for that. There's the streaming, there's a whole different economy, there's the social response to movies can sometimes tank it. But I do think, look, this was a particularly provocative idea. I think it's a funny idea. I think the idea of like making it a fake world leader is not is kind of toothless. I totally think that satire. I mean, I grew up with very kind of harsh political satire, and I'm all for it. I'm not saying advocating for murder, but it
Yeah.
was very clear that this was a satire. Like, I don't think anyone it would take a long stretch to be like, oh, this James Franco Seth Rogen movie is really American propaganda to make sure that someone kills the leader of North Korea. I don't think that was the aim at all.
Right.
Um, but I think if you just look at the last 10 years, it's really hard to look at like find a big studio movie. I mean, I talk about in the podcast, like Borat 2 was very controversial and was
Yeah.
made within a particularly, at least I think Amazon released that. But man, there used to be even movies like Zero Dark 30 or The Hurt Locker
Hmm.
feel much further away just because it's like if you're going to spend 35 to 135 million dollars on a movie, you got to be sitting there being like, are we going to piss people off so bad that it's going to tank our investment and lead, maybe even lead to threats of some kind? I mean, so again, it's impossible to know how much The
Yeah.
Interview really had a day in day out effect on that, but I think if you look at it, like it had to have kind of stick in the back of people's minds.
I think it must have, especially in, people think of Hollywood as this really creative place and where a lot of ideas are thrown around and all of that kind of thing. But it's also a very risk averse type of place. They make things that work. Like, look at the last 15 years of movies. You're looking at Marvel, and a few other things. They look for guaranteed stuff. The Interview was not something that was a guaranteed hit by any stretch. Even without this, had this never happened, that would have been maybe a middling sort of, this is 40 type of hit or something like that.
Well, I mean, I will say, like Sony originally, they moved the date around this a bit. I think it was supposed to be the fall of 2014, and then when they realized they had to pause it, they really did move it to Christmas 2014, which is the date you give a movie if you have a lot of confidence. Like I do
True.
think, and the budget of this movie was not huge, so I think you're right. I mean, the risk averseness, the risk aversion is definitely more deeply felt than ever, though that's kind of always been there. But I think it was just this particular moment where at that point, like Rogan and Goldberg, everything they'd done and made a profit, and their movies were being made for so like affordably that I think Sony was like, this could really be like a big hit. And I think they certainly at the outset, like they were like, this is going to do well for us. Like this, I think they sort of felt like it was going to have a commercial and cultural impact. Because that was I think that's what Sony really wanted to do at that point.
Yeah, it did seem like they were interested in making kind of a big splash. They were in a little bit of a struggling period. So they were like, oh, this looks like something that could really get our name back out there. And, it certainly did, not in the way they
Yeah, and comedy
intended.
had been really good for Sony. Comedy had been like Sony's one thing where it's like they couldn't always get superhero movies right. They had trouble launching franchises, but like literary adaptations like Captain or real life events like Captain Phillips,
Mm.
or like comedies like a Sandler or Will Smith or a Seth Rogen comedy in the 2010s and 2000s did very well for Sony. That was kind of like the thing they were best at.
Yeah. One of the things that was really interesting to me, you spoke to a whole bunch of people inside Sony, outside, was the folks talking about the immediate aftermath of the hack, that day and the immediate, say,
Hmm.
days to 1 week later, when some of the folks thought, oh, well, we'll be up and running in a few hours, or maybe tomorrow morning, everything will be fine. And it sort of slowly, the creeping dread dawned on them of like, oh no, we're not going to be fine.
Yeah.
Not only are we not going to be fine, we're going to be in real, real trouble. That sort of sense of like the building tension of what the consequences of this was like, how much of that were people still dealing with, 10 years later when you spoke to them for the podcast?
I mean, it's interesting because my biggest concern when I started doing this was I wasn't going to get anyone who worked at Sony to talk to me, and I can't even tell you the number of people. I apologize to the possibly hundreds, multiple hundreds of people on LinkedIn that I just sent messages to with the subject podcast about Sony hack, because 95% of them did not write back to me, and a few who did were like, I don't want to do this, you know. But I really wanted to talk to people who were there on the ground, so because I think that was the only way for people listeners to understand what it's like to even go through this. I mean, I've had identity theft, but I've never had anything like this. And I think there's a little bit of a fog of war with the memory of. I mean, almost everyone I talked to who worked at Sony who went through this at certain times, some of them before our interview had actually gone through and written a timeline because they had forgotten, like, it's because again it happened so quickly.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think, I think some people in the IT department, and I think some people higher up executives, I think early on those people were like, this is something bigger than just a tech malfunction. But for the people who worked in marketing or who worked in the editing labs at Sony, the ones I talked to, a lot of them thought this is going to kind of blow over pretty quickly
Hmm.
because by 2014 everyone's had some weird phishing scam mess up your email for a day. Everyone's had some sort of security outage at their work, and very boring kind of like everyone stay offline for the next 2 hours. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
So I think some people thought, oh, this will be just like another kind of run of the mill sort of hacking or sort of tech headache. I mean, everyone just thought it was a pain in the ass at first, and then even in the first couple of days when they were adjusting and trying to find kind of analog ways of doing business, a lot of them still thought, well, this will be over soon, right? I think it wasn't until the Sunday after the hack, which was on a Monday, that weekend, which was Thanksgiving weekend, unreleased Sony movies started leaking online,
Yeah.
and that for a lot of people was like, oh, because if you work in the industry, that is bad. That is a tangible, like, oh, this is going to screw up our next 3 months. These movies that have not been released are available online, and so I think that made it really real to people. And that was before all the email. I mean, that was before people realized the depths of like the emails that have been hacked and the documents. I mean, I think it was a very slow realization of how severe the hack was, but once it started, it was just like this broken roller coaster, just sinking down, down, down every day. People just kind of screaming more and more, understandably. It just kind of hurtled towards some weird fate.
And outside of the business impact, I know there were a few folks on the podcast, and I'm sorry, I won't recall the gentleman's name that you spoke to. He was talking about how when he came home, I think he was a marketing exec. He came home and was speaking to his husband, and his husband said, "Do I need to be worried?" And he
Yeah,
was like, I don't know. It's
yeah.
kind of that, did I write something in an email that's going to affect my loved ones in some unforeseen way, even if it's benign, something that completely out of your hands, then it's just out there.
Yeah, and I think because so many of the leaked email headlines were about Amy Pascal, who's this very high up Sony
Hmm.
executive, or they were about Scott Rudin, who's a producer, a very powerful producer who worked with Sony. I think a lot of people forgot or never even realized that all these emails, I forget how many, I think it's 175,000 emails total were leaked around WikiLeaks still. The majority of them are just people who work at Sony who are literally setting up a meeting
Yeah.
or trying to get approval for some project, or what about this, what about that, or like, it's like, hey, I can't come in, my dog needs, literally like my dog needs emergency surgery today, or my car is blocked, I'm going to be in half an hour. It's really banal stuff like that. And, it only went back a year or two in the Sony history, but everyone's written things. I mean, like, I've definitely never written anything to this to like that would get me fired from a job, but I've definitely written, everyone gets I'm always joking, the worst kind of email I never want to find is when someone forwards you something and you write back and just write ugh, like, hey, Jan and Stu are gonna be joining us on this project, you write back, oh, you're like, that's not an email you want to get out. Like, I'd rather have something that like says how much you know what I mean?
Yep.
It's one of those things where we all kind of and I see it on Slack still. I've worked on projects with people where people put in Slack, and I'm like, I don't think I would not put that in Slack. I'm just sort of like, let's not be too frank here at this moment. That's easily traceable. Um,
Yeah.
so I do think, but these are people who were just like they were they were working on a marketing campaign for a new Spider-Man movie, and all of a sudden their kids' health insurance records are out there, and they
Yeah.
don't know what that means, understandably, or what that could mean. And to be honest, I spoke to a lot of people on background because a lot of them were happy to talk about this event, but their big thing was, I don't want to go on the record because I just don't want it to happen again because my information's already out there,
Yeah.
and I totally understand that. And some people were still really worried about I think the kids' health insurance record for some of the employees is still, to this day, understandably very upsetting to some of the Sony employees because it's still out there. And their kids are still kids, some of them are not even, or teenagers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of gross stuff that you don't really think about right away. You're more concerned about, oh, did I say something bad about my manager or some VP in an email?
Right.
You know, it's not like, oh, my kid's social security number is out there. Like, what are we doing? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
there were two interesting things from the security standpoint to me that I sort of occurred to me while listening to the podcast. One is the North Korea aspect of this. As I said, very quickly after the hack, the FBI and DOJ came out and said, we know who this is, and they
Mm.
knew before, long before that. They knew right away. And the Lazarus Group was well known in the security community before this. They were one of the sort of apex predators in the security
Yeah.
world, and had been responsible for some pretty big operations before that. So a lot of researchers and threat intelligence folks had sort of pointed to them and been like, "Yep, know who it is." And the other part was, I didn't I wasn't sure how much the Hollywood people really cared who was responsible for it. Obviously, there was a connection because of the movie, but when it came down to it, did the people that you spoke to really give a shit who the attackers even were, or was it just more about what the results were?
I think it's probably the results. I mean, I certainly think there were people I spoke to who were frustrated, one way or the other, that this movie had kind of had specifically apparently provoked North Korea. I mean, there was, I mentioned on the podcast, but there were some people I talked to on background who said that by the time things were getting really bad in December, they were kind of thinking, why do we make this movie? Was it
Yeah,
worth it to make this? At the same time, the other people I spoke to who said, look, this is America, and we have free speech, and like this is trying to impose censorship. And I can understand both those perspectives because I do feel like at a certain point you've such a headache where you're being hacked that after 3 weeks you're like, this was for a Seth Rogen movie, like why, what? But I think some people I spoke to would ask me, they would say, have they even figured out who this was? I think for the people who went through this, the lack of any kind of trial or real sort of like like easily definable, I can point to this person and know that this is who did it. I think that is frustrating for them. It feels a little like they'll never get, the word closure is so overused, but I think there is a little bit of a lack of closure for some
yeah,
people. But also, honestly, a lot of Sony employees I talked to when I would reach out to them, if they wrote me back, one of the first things they would say inevitably was, "I have not thought about this in 10 years," and it's because I think it was just like it was incredibly stressful and fast moving, and I don't blame them. Like you just want to move on and not dwell on like this weird time where someone was possibly threatening to like attack your studio lot
right.
if you read the warnings that way.
Yeah, you just sort of block it out, and you're just like, that happened. I don't really want to think about it anymore. There
Yeah, I don't blame it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's nothing I can do about it now. Why do I need to revisit that?
yeah,
Um, you were able to speak to a whole bunch of different people, but you obviously weren't able to get Amy Pascal, who I don't think has spoken about this really. You had the one, some of the quotes she had at a live event at one point.
yeah.
Um, if you were able to ask her a question or two that she would answer honestly, had you thought about what those questions would be?
Well, I mean, I do think I would want to ask about why Don't Mess with the Zohan never got a sequel. I think that's something that everyone would want to know first. Actually, that movie is very funny. That's like my favorite of the Adam Sandler. I think that's Sony. That's a very good question. I would love to. I mean, the two things I'd be most interested in a big picture way is her memory of that first week, I would love to know. She would never tell me. I would want to know what those first 2 weeks of phone calls were like, because she had to talk to a lot of people and apologize. And I'm just kind of curious what the evolution, her thinking was. Was she defensive at first about this? Was she accepting of it? I think, at one point she flew to New York to meet with Al Sharpton, who was very upset about some of the racial inequity or the inequity in terms of pay, and also some of the comments that had been made. I'd be very interested in hearing what a Al Sharpton Amy Pascal meeting in 2014, how that went. I would also, I think I want to know most from her is sort of looking back 10 years later. What did you learn from all this? Is kind of a very obvious kind of Barbara Walters-y question, but I would be kind of interested in what the next 10 years of her professional life was like in terms of how she dealt with creative people. I mean, from a logistical point of view, did it make her feel more cautious sometimes giving notes to people or saying, but it's tough. I mean, she lost her job, or she either resigned or was fired from her job. The narrative kind of
Yeah.
shifts. Um, she lost her job in the wake of this. I think she put some stuff in emails that was really foolish and insensitive. Um, she's also a flawed person, as we all are, and she, is a genuinely great movie executive and now a great movie producer. I don't think this will be like I don't think this will be like her legacy is this hack. I think she'll probably win a Best Picture Oscar before her career is over. But I would hope this doesn't define her, but I'm curious how much she felt this defined her professional life going forward. I mean, I don't know, does Amy Pascal sit in meetings in 2024 with people she, made a joke about in 2013 and 2014? I would be kind of curious about that. She would never tell me any of this, and I don't blame her. She's very smart to not talk about this anymore.
That's a good point. The sort of, how do I go into these meetings? How do I speak to these people who I may have said something about? Or even if I never reference them in an email or something, I'm the person that was at Sony when this happened. Even though she's maybe not
Yeah,
directly responsible for that, but that's something people in the security industry have to deal with all the time. I was the chief security
yeah,
officer at XYZ company when we got breached. So now every job from now on, I'm the guy that was there when we got hacked. There's sort of that
yeah.
brand on you.
Yeah, and Dan Sterling, who wrote the interview, who I spoke to the podcast, I don't think I could include this, but when we talked, he mentioned that after the hack for a couple of years, he would always get asked to kind of meet with these cyber, go to these like cyber conferences and sort of meet with these experts, which I think he was very interested in, but I think also a little bemused, being like it's like
Yeah.
he was just the guy who wrote the movie. He didn't intentionally set into place some wild, this was nothing he ever kind of anticipated happening. But and the other thing I would love to ask is I'd love to talk to Michael Linton, who was the Sony executive who was also involved with this. He was very close to the Obama White House, and I've always been interested in what the back channel conversations were like between the White House and Sony during all of this, because it clearly at some point communication was dropped. Obama made this comment at a press conference that really frustrated Michael Linton and Sony, and I am just kind of interested in how those wires were crossed and what the political maneuverings were behind the scenes of trying to get the White House on their side, which I think was seemed like it didn't always work in Sony's favor back
I'd
then.
love to know that too, because I think you included it in the podcast. Yeah. Obama said, I wish we hadn't, or I wish Sony hadn't pulled the movie. Sony didn't actually pull the movie. It was a bunch of theater
Yeah,
chains that decided not to show it, which, two different things. Sony does not own those movie theater chains. That's not how that works. But
right.
I think his point was, we don't want to acquiesce to any of this outside pressure, especially from North Korea. And he called it a
Yeah.
mistake, I think. And I'd love to know.
He said I wish they'd spoken to
Oh,
me
yes.
first, which is the ultimate, like, that's the parent in the front seat of the car picking you up after you get in trouble at school, disappointment. It's like, I'm not gonna ground you, but I hope you know how
Oh,
disappointed
I got
I am.
goosebumps. I
Like,
was like, oh man,
it was
I've heard
tough.
that before. I know how that talk is going to go.
Yeah,
But you don't want to hear that from the president of
yeah.
the United States, honestly. That's a bad day.
No, especially at that point where he was kind of still like riding high, it was still very cool. And like these were all, most people at Sony were like Obama people, I would
Hmm.
assume. This is like your guy is kind of taking you down live on a, nationally televised press
Right.
conference.
And on sort of a tangent, Obama had a pretty solid group of cybersecurity advisors around him and was pretty progressive on
Hmm.
cybersecurity policy. So I think he understood like that part of it. But
Yeah,
So there was a whole bunch of different things at play there. It's not a simple answer, one way or the other. Um,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So were there any people aside from maybe Pascal and maybe Linton who you tried to get that you would have really, really liked to include in the podcast? I mean, maybe Rogan or, James Franco or
I
something.
mean, Rogan and Goldberg for sure. I could easily, like I said, I talked to, I think there are 4 or 5 Sony employees in the
Hmm.
show total. I talked to at least 2 or 3 times as many. I mean, again, I reached out to hundreds of them. I would have loved to talk to as many Sony people as possible just on the ground. And there were a couple who spoke to me on background who I wish had spoken on the record, but I totally understand their reasons for not wanting to do so. Um, but there's other players in this. I mean, it would have been great to talk to someone maybe in the Obama White House who was kind of, like I said, kind of coordinating on this. I don't know whether that would have gotten the most frank response about that. And I think the one thing I didn't get to work on quite as much that I would have liked to include, it's a little too inside baseballs. I did want to talk to other movie studios about this and kind of how they were feeling about their own movies, playing in theaters next to this movie that had been threatened. But I was very happy because I did feel like we had a kind of a really tough list of, I want to cover the theater owners experience, I want to cover the Sony employees experience, I want to cover, get as much as I can about Pascal and Linton's experiences. Um, and I think we managed to get all that. And I would have been curious to talk to Scott Rudin. I mean, I would not have done it in person. I do not want anything thrown at me.
Nope.
But he probably does not throw people to anyone anymore. But he's kind of a fascinating guy. And look, he's a Hollywood legend who's currently, I think, trying to make his comeback effort right now. And he made some amazing movies for Sony. And then you read those emails and you're like, this is such an intelligent, sophisticated guy, and these are the dumb jokes he writes. That's the thing too, where you're just sort of like, oh, there's no real grown-ups anywhere. It's like everyone's just we're all kind of ridiculous. Like no matter how much power, experience, maturity you accrue at a certain point, you're still like gonna make a
Of
stupid
course,
joke.
this is the thing I tell my kids all the time. Everyone's just making it up as they go along. Nobody knows what they're doing. So just
Yeah,
get used to that.
yeah,
You mentioned the theater owner part of it. I think that was my favorite, not character, but my favorite person in the podcast was the Nashville uh, theater operator who was
yeah. The programming,
he,
Toby
he
Leonard,
was
he's
just
great.
like,
Yeah,
you know what, screw it, we're gonna show this, and
yeah,
people came out, and he was like throwing t-shirts in the crowd and all that kind of stuff. I thought that was great
yeah.
because it was a very real concern at the time, as you mentioned. Should we show this? Are we, like, theaters were getting bomb threats? Nobody actually knew what was going to happen. Nothing really happened, but it wasn't
Yeah.
just sort of a throwaway concern.
No, and Toby, who's great, I think he's being very honest when he says that he wasn't super nervous about it, and I do love his story. He's great. He's great at talking about that. But I do think he and all the theater owners who showed the interview after it had been pulled by the big chains, I think that's a super cool story. I think that was kind of brave. I mean, not to get too into it, but like I lived in New York during 9/11, and like I know what it's like when like there's threats still, and you're getting on the subway in a random October morning, and 2 years after 9/11, there's some, you're on a red alert or orange alert. Like, no matter how much you want to be like, I'm not going to let them win, I'm going to really walk into the face of it. It's
Yeah,
fucking scary. Like, it's not. It's intimidating, and that thing was so strange. Where when a threat invokes 9/11, and you work in a business where your people are trusting you and they come in and work and they hang out in your theater, that's a big responsibility. I don't shame the big theater owners for saying we want to walk away with this. But I think the braver decision was made by all these indie theaters across America, and they decided to play this, and it was cool. It became an event. I actually didn't see it in the theater. I think I was traveling, or I mean, I had very young kids at that time, but I did watch it on Google like the day it came out. It was like a weird patriotic thing, as much as weird as it is to like give Google 4.99 or whatever. It feels like a patriotic act, which it's not, because I'm sure that data was used to spy on me 10 years later. Um, but it did feel like yeah, you know what, screw you. Like people want to make these movies, and is the interview is not like what I would hold up as like the movie I'd want to stake my claim for the rights of artists in America. I still think it's a fun movie, but that's what America is. Like we get these works of art that we have to champion, and if it's Andre Serrano or if it's the interview, it's like we got to say, hey, we got to do this. So that was a very that was a it was actually almost heartwarming to go back and watch some of that footage of people showing up to watch this movie at 8:30 on Christmas Day, because even they didn't care about the interview. they saw it as some sort of like I'm going to as a kind of a middle finger to these perceived terrorists or
Yeah, it was
terrorists, you
sort of
know?
a, act of, dissent or whatever. And I think you say it, maybe it's in the last episode, something about, I like dangerous ideas. Those are my sort of favorite kind of ideas. And there's not really a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
dangerous ideas floating around in the creative world anymore, especially in Hollywood or TV. As you said, I don't know that I'd want to stake like American freedom on the interview, but the the thought is, yes, maybe it's a silly movie and it's a goofy idea, but having a state-backed threat actor come and hack one of the biggest movie studios in the world in response for a dopey satire, we can't really have that, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's why Obama was so frustrated because I think that was the argument he was making. He's like, look, are we going to start folding when someone gets angry about a
Yeah,
documentary or or reporting? I think it is, look, it's to me it seems like an open and shut thing where it's like, well, of course they should have shown the movie. I still think it was very, and Toby's right, like why not just show this? But I also think it was, as much as Toby kind of downplays it, it was a brave act. You
you
don't know
never
what's
know.
going to happen. And yeah, you never know. And but to do that in the face of those threats, I thought was
Yeah,
pretty
I did
ballsy.
too. Yeah. So after this podcast, what's next for you? I mentioned you've done the other narrative podcast, the Siskel and Ebert one, the Vietnam War movie one. What's next up for you?
I'm doing a book right now that I pitched a long while ago. So it's a book that's newly relevant now, but I'm doing a book about Hannibal Lecter, about the making of all those films and Tom Harris's books. I did this before the former president decided to start talking about Hannibal Lecter every 2 weeks because every time he gives a rally and mentions Hannibal Lecter, someone texts me about it. And it's usually he's using the exact same lines all the time, which is hilarious. So yeah, a book about the late great Hannibal Lecter. So I've been doing research for that for the last 8 or 9 months, and I start writing it I think next week. And then I'm hoping to do another podcast with the Ringer for next summer. I've done three of these for August, and I kind of it's a nice slot. Generally love working with them, and they're really fun to do. So hope we can do another one on those. But it will not be that will not be about anything that Trump's talking about on rallies. It will not be about. But it's like Hannibal Lecter is one thing. He's a couple other go-to jokes, but it's so funny because part of me is like, oh boy, this is really weird that he's mentioning this. Like this is so strange. What is he talking about? The other part of me is like, I guess this is good promotion for a book
I
that's
was
not
going to
coming
say,
out
you
for
got to
two
rush it out,
for
Brian,
two
if you
more
haven't even
years. Like,
started writing it,
oh,
though.
I got to get him. I got to get him to do a blurb on Hannibal Lecter, and it would just be 7,000 words in the back cover
Oh,
about
God.
asylums.
So is the book going to be about the character itself, like treating it as like a person?
It's a biography of the character. It's a kind of a tricky thing we're trying to do. It's my same editor as Simon and Schuster, who I did my book with last time. But yeah, it's looking at I've gone through the archives, a lot of the filmmakers. I've interviewed FBI people. I've interviewed Michael Mann. I've interviewed who
Oh,
did one of the Lecter films. I've talked to people from all over, kind of both the publishing side, the movie side, and the FBI side. And the idea is like let's look at how this character was made and what and sort of how it moved through the culture, but also the bigger idea of like how did a guy who literally eats a cop's face become our favorite anti-hero still in the year 2024. Like he's I think he's almost eclipsed Darth Vader now at this point as like the most unlikely beloved bad guy. And also looking at all the true crimes, the true crime phenomenon that Silence of the
yeah.
Lambs kicked off. So it's stuff like that, which has been it's been really, really fun to research. Like talking to FBI people who worked with the movies and worked with Tom Harris. It's
That's
been
awesome.
really fascinating.
That's right up my alley. I would love to see that whenever that comes out. Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
cool.
Hey, you mentioned your earlier book. It's about 1999, the best movie year ever. I just finished it maybe a week ago. It's so
Oh,
good.
thanks.
I love it. Anybody who's kind of a movie
Oh,
nerd
thank
like I
you.
am, there's a bunch of movies in there that I honestly haven't seen. Like I can't even think of the ones. There's a couple. But I read those chapters anyway because I just wanted to know about the process of how those movies were made. A lot of the biggest hits in 1999 almost never got made, which is true of a lot of movies. I mean, any movie getting made is a
Yeah,
miracle.
yeah.
But that I love that book so much because it just sort of like zeroed in on this one
Oh, thanks.
weird period where a lot of people had kind of similar
Yeah.
ideas but expressed them in different ways. How did that idea come up to you? Was it just sort of out of the blue? Like, I really think this is a good movie here. Let's do a book.
Well, I worked at Entertainment Weekly that year. It was my first job out of college. I was there for 4 years, and that fall, Entertainment Weekly actually published a cover story on 1999, like the year that changed movies. And I think it was a very smart story at the time. Like I don't think people were quite picking up on that. I think at that point, every year was
Yeah,
kind of an amazing movie year, depending how you looked at it, especially if you worked at Entertainment Weekly, where we were very very conversed in what was going on in film. And then I think, I'd always been kind of fascinated by that year culturally for a lot of reasons. And so I actually, this was probably like 10 years ago, I started thinking about a book about Y2K, Y2K, people who, I actually really interested in people who actually went full in on Y2K and, the people who were the preppers and stuff. And so I started thinking about that year. And so I'd originally wanted to do a book on all the cultural events of that year, which was like Woodstock and Eminem and Columbine, which is not a cultural event but had an impact on the culture, and the movies and Britney Spears and The Sopranos and The Daily Show kind of taking off. And then I had a very smart editor at Simon and Schuster, Sean Manning, who was like, I think you should just use, what if you just did the movies of that year and just use that as the prism, which was a really smart idea. And I said, no, I think my idea is better. And then like 2 weeks later, I was like, what am I talking about? This guy is like super smart and like wants to do this book with me. And he was totally right. Like you could use the movies of that year. And what's been really fun this year is, I did the book 5 years ago because it's the 20th anniversary of all those movies. And this year is the 25th anniversary. So even just this week, I've done three different Zoom in events or things for theaters, all these great nonprofit theaters around the country, which are doing these 1999 series. And what's so cool about that isn't in the book for me, it's like every one of them is picking different movies from that year. Like that's kind of showing
yeah,
how varied that year was. Like for some of them, it's like we're doing Fight Club and The Matrix, and that's our bread and butter. Or like we're doing Boys Don't Cry and Election, or we're doing all of them, or we're throwing in some crazy, like they're throwing in some kind of like wild kind of, like a movie like Talented Mr. Ripley. I thought it was fantastic when I saw it. It was a sizable hit, but it was nowhere near as culturally like
yeah,
beloved as it is now. Like, and that's, and neither is in Eyes Wide Shut is like they show it here at Christmas now at three different theaters in LA. Like, it is a genuine. It might be one of the five biggest movies of that year now culturally. Um, and it was not at the time. It was kind of like a lot of the films from that year, like Fight Club or Office Space. Like it didn't connect immediately with a mass audience that year. It took time. So it's been very cool to see those movies are
yeah.
still
It's true.
connecting
I
with
didn't see
people.
Eyes Wide Shut until like 2 years ago. I've seen. Yeah, I just
Oh
I knew it was
yeah,
this weird thing with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. I was like, I don't really care. And then once I saw it, I was like, that's not at all what I thought it was, which you describe in the book as well. People thought it was one thing, and it's not really that at all. Um, which is also true of
yeah.
Office Space, I think. One of my favorite movies, and everybody in the security community loves that movie too, just because it's like, you know,
Oh sure.
the drudgery of office work and like sort of the Superman virus and that kind of thing. Um, yeah, and The
Yes. Yeah.
Matrix
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
is a huge movie in the hacker community, which I remember when I saw it
Yeah.
the first time, I it just sort of bent my brain because I'd never seen any. There was nothing else like that. Nothing else had been made like that.
Right.
And the way that you described the way that the Wachowski, I never know how to pronounce that. Okay. How the
I think it's
Wachowskis had
Wachowski's. Yeah.
to go through the process of finding somebody to make this, even though they had had this idea since they were children and had been filling up notebooks and all this kind of stuff, and they had the whole world realized. It was only in 99 that, or maybe 98 when they started making it, that the technology sort of caught up and people's imaginations could sort of wrap their heads around, okay, the internet's a thing, computers are a thing. What if there's people inside the computer and there's just shit going on? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's also like that year, that movie is very emblematic of that year because that movie basically had to happen because at that point, we were talking about risk aversion earlier. There's a lot of fondness for 90s movies. I get that. I'm a Gen Xer. I know that nostalgia. There was also a lot
yes.
of garbage. And the big studios were really kind of like at a certain point in the mid 90s when they're making The Odd Couple Part Two, and you're like, what the, like, it's just like, what is going on? I mean, now it seems like they were, it seems like there were tons of original ideas, which there were. But I think what happened then at that point in the mid 90s was the big studios, they saw the independents were making all this headway. I mean, all the cultural momentum in film was like Darren Aronofsky and Tarantino and, and like all these filmmakers who were making these things on their own. And the big studios were, like I said, they were like, well, here's The Odd Couple too, and you're like, what is, no one wants this. So I think the studios at that point, even though people, Warner Brothers, big executives were like, I don't understand what this script The Matrix is about. They were like, okay, let's make it. Like maybe people will get it. Like at that point, what do they have to lose? Like they couldn't make The Odd Couple 3 at that point. Which I, to be fair, I don't think that was a Warner Brothers movie. I don't know why I keep beating up on The Odd Couple 2, but it was they needed to really push things to get people excited and into the theaters, and that's what a lot of those movies were. There's like Fight Club or Magnolia, substantially risky, substantially budgeted movies that were very risky. Those were big stars taking 6 months to 2 years out of their lives to make a movie that could be very alienating or off-putting or
Yeah,
just simply
and a lot of them
unsuccessful.
weren't, as you mentioned earlier, with Office Space and some of the others, were not big box office hits at all. They've had this sort of long tail,
No, no,
which Mike Judge has talked a lot about with Office Space. He's like, nobody cared, no one cared, you know.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and Fight Club, as someone who was, I remember at the time covering it, like the how dare you about Fight Club coming from DC and coming from within Hollywood, like really like people thinking
Hmm.
this is an irresponsible movie. Again, it came out after Columbine, which I think probably heightened people's response to it. But there were people, there were very big Hollywood people who spoke out against Fight Club, who and I do think I understand their passion, but I think it was kind of misplaced. It's there was substantial pushback to these movies, both kind of commercially and kind of like
Yeah,
culturally as
definitely,
well for some
especially The
people.
Matrix. I think, I don't know about you describe it very well in the book, the sort of difficulty they had getting it made. But then after it came out, I think a lot of people really loved it, and then other people, even like me, I kind of liked it, but I was like, I'm not sure I understood what the hell happened in that movie. I truly have no idea until you watch it like two or three. I can't even imagine looking at a
Right.
script and trying to parse out what this story is, especially the bullet time thing that you described so eloquently in the book. And
Yeah.
they just had a couple of sentences that were like, and then Neo does weird shit and bullets go this way. It's like, how do you, and they had to build a
Yeah.
completely new technology to even film it.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about that movie in particular, and I think Fight Club, is that you walk out of the movie initially
Hmm.
so kind of pulverized by what you just saw on the screen that, for The Matrix especially, I think it's only the second or third viewing that people go back and kind of look at the ideas on it. And what's interesting about The Matrix is that you could have two very intelligent people sitting at a table saying, this is what The Matrix is about, and the other person saying, this is what The Matrix is about, and they could be completely different, but they're not wrong. And I think that movie was also obviously, I mean, that movie is 99. I've been on the internet for a while before that, but I think certainly in the 2000s, like the idea of, there are even more ways to discuss films and just, you could just say a lot with a Morpheus GIF at a certain point in the conversation. So Fight Club and Office Space and The Matrix, of all those movies that year, benefited. They just stayed in the online discourse forever, whether you were just quoting them, whether you were really doing a rabbit hole look at them or arguing about them. So those films, certainly, the combination of DVD and the kind of early 2000s wild but not seemingly like horrific kind of free range internet, I think made those movies gave those movies kind of cultural legs they might not have had
No, I
if
agree. I
it was
think
the other
the
way
hacker
around.
community in '99 just glommed onto the Matrix right away. Loved it. It still loves it,
Yeah,
but there are certain pockets that are like, no, it's an action movie. No, it's a hacker movie. No, it's this metaphysical allegory for our, existential struggle or whatever it is. I just enjoy it as an action movie, and
yeah,
I like, really some like, that's a fun movie, but
yeah,
but
yeah. It's the ultimate like look how good technology is good. Look how good technology is for us. Look how terrible
yeah,
technology is good for us. I think you can look at that movie like all the great kind of techno thrillers or dramas. I think they always have those two ideas. Whether it's RoboCop or whether it's Dark City. Those are those. That's what
yeah.
makes that or Blade Runner or Blade. It's like that's what makes that genre so fascinating. It's like it really is. It affirms all your fears and also affirms everything that's wonderful about technology. And I think that's what people kind of miss when they try to make allegories for AI or whatever. It's like you can't just treat it as like all the machines are evil is kind of a boring plot. It's not really an idea. What's interesting is like this thing that we love could also be destroying us. Like that's what's
No,
so
it's true. And
fascinating
I
about
mean,
all those
that sort
movies,
of like loops back to the Sony story in some ways because email's great, computers are great, the internet's great, but they can also be turned against us
Yeah,
and everything can go to shit in like 12 hours,
yeah.
you know? and then
Yeah,
station
absolutely.
it. So, all right, Brian, thank you so much for your time, man. I really enjoyed this. I love the podcast. Um,
Oh, you got it. Thank you.
Everybody go check it out. The
Thanks so
Hollywood
much. I really
Hack. It's
appreciate
on
it.
Spotify. It's everywhere. It's on the ringer.com, one of my favorite websites. So go check it out. Thanks a lot, Brian.